The dog stopped walking. Then, he refused to move. Logan Reed pulled the leash once, twice, and Shadow only sank lower into a crouch, ears flat, nose driving into the frozen grass like he meant to dig through to the other side of the world. Logan had spent 6 years reading every twitch of this animal's body in places far more dangerous than a Montana hayfield, and the signal in front of him now was unmistakable. Something was here. Something the ground was trying to keep. The wind came hard across the back acreage, carrying the smell of wet pine and turned soil where there should have only been frost. Logan was supposed to be inside right now, signing the last page of a contract that would hand his father's land to a man named Harlan Voss for good. He had told himself this would be quick. He had told himself he wouldn't feel anything walking this field one last time. He was wrong about both. Shadow's paws tore at a patch of earth sunk 3 inches lower than the ground around it, soft where everything else had frozen hard weeks ago. Logan knelt down beside him. Buried beneath the loose dirt and a tangle of dead blackberry vine, his fingers found something that was not a root, not a stone, not anything that belonged in an empty field. It was wood. Carved, and it had been there a very long time. Before we go any further, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story moves you, stay with it until the very end, because what Logan found in that field would unravel a secret this town had buried for 15 years. We read every comment, and we want to know how far this story travels. Logan Reed was 39 years old, built like a man who had spent 2 decades being paid to be quietly dangerous and had never quite learned how to put that down. He stood just over 6 feet, broad through the chest and forearms in the specific way of men who'd carried gear up mountains for a living, with dark hair cut close at the sides and a beard he kept short out of habit rather than style. A thin white scar ran along his left eyebrow, souvenir of a fast rope mishap outside Kandahar that he rarely mentioned. His eyes were pale steel blue, the kind that seemed to measure exits and distances and the weight of a man's intentions before he'd said a single word. Eyes that had spent 18 years scanning rooftops and doorways and had never quite learned to stop. He was not an unfriendly man. Life, and the work he'd done in service of it, had simply sanded away the parts of him that used to speak first. He moved through the world now with the contained, economical stillness of someone who had nothing left to prove to anyone, least of all himself. People who met him at the hardware store or the feedlot in town mistook his quiet for distance. It wasn't distance. It was discipline. The same discipline that had once kept him breathing through 6 combat deployments, now repurposed for the smaller, stranger task of learning how to live an ordinary life in a town that had no idea what he used to do for a living. Logan had spent 18 years as a Navy SEAL, attached over the years to naval special warfare units that took him through Ramadi, 2 rotations in Helmand Province, and a final deployment in eastern Syria. He'd signed paperwork promising never to fully describe. He'd left the Navy 2 years ago as a senior chief. Not because the work had broken him, but because his father's heart finally had, and somebody needed to come home to bury a parent and figure out what to do with 60 acres of Montana hayfield that had been in the Reed family since 1947. He told himself the trip back would last a few months. 2 years later he was still here, still telling himself the same thing. He had buried his father in the spring, sold off the cattle by summer, and spent most evenings since sitting on a porch that felt too quiet for a man who'd spent 2 decades surrounded by noise. He had not expected grief to feel like silence. He had not expected to miss the weight of purpose more than he missed the danger. He had agreed to sell the land to Harlan Voss because staying felt like waiting for something that was never going to arrive. Shadow was a 6-year-old German shepherd, 75 pounds of black and tan muscle, with a coat that darkened to near black along his spine and ears. A jagged white scar ran across his left flank, the legacy of an eyed fragment outside a compound in Helmand that had ended his deployment, and very nearly ended him. Logan had spent 4 months fighting Navy paperwork to adopt him when the program retired him, and Shadow had not left his side since. Not the discharge physical, not the funeral, not the long, empty months that followed. He moved with the clean, deliberate economy of a dog who had learned, the hard way, the difference between noise and threat. He did not bark at shadows. He did not react to nothing. In 2 years, Logan had watched him ignore 100 ordinary sounds and freeze dead, still, exactly twice. Both times for good reason. This was the third. The Reed property sat on the edge of Combe County, Montana. 60 acres of hayfield and scrub pine framed by the kind of empty sky that made a man feel both small and entirely alone. November had stripped the cottonwoods bare along the creek line, and the wind moved through them with a sound like something exhaling. The air smelled of frost and turned earth, and, underneath it, faintly, of something older, the mineral smell of ground that had been disturbed and resettled more than once. Logan's truck sat idling near the gate, exhaust curling white against a sky the color of wet concrete. Out here, sound carried strangely. A man could call for help and not be heard for half a mile in any direction. Harlan Voss had run Combe County for the better part of 30 years, first as a rancher with more land than sense, then as a county commissioner who had never once lost an election because he had never once needed to campaign honestly. He was 58 years old, thick through the middle in the way of men who used to be strong and had let the strength go soft without losing any of the weight it once carried, with silver hair combed back hard and a handshake that lasted exactly 1 second too long. He owned the only bank in town, sat on the board of the only hospital, and had quietly bought up half the failing farms in the county over the past decade at prices that always seemed to arrive right after the bank called in a loan he himself had approved. People in Combe County did not cross Harlan Voss. The sheriff had gone to high school with him. The county attorney's daughter worked at his bank. He had been investigated twice in 20 years for land deals that smelled wrong, and both times the investigations had quietly disappeared before they reached a courtroom. He liked to say, at the diner counter where he held court most mornings, that a man who owned the dirt owned everything that grew out of it, including, he sometimes added with a smile that never reached his eyes, whatever happened to be buried in it. Nobody had ever asked him what he meant by that. Until now, nobody had needed to. Margaret Calloway was 71 years old and had not changed the porch light outside her house in 15 years. Not once, not even when the bulb burned out, because changing it felt too much like giving up on the night her daughter might finally walk back into it. Caroline Calloway had been 17 the last time anyone in Combe County saw her. A quiet, sharp-eyed girl who worked Saturdays at the feed store and had dreams, her mother liked to say, bigger than this whole county could hold. She had vanished on a Friday night in October, and the sheriff's department had spent exactly 11 days looking before quietly filing her as a runaway and closing the file. Peggy had never believed it. She had spent 15 years driving the back roads on the anniversary of that night, calling Caroline's name into fields that never answered. The town had stopped looking a long time ago. Peggy never had. Logan didn't call the sheriff that first night. He told himself it was because the ground was too frozen to do anything responsibly until morning, and that was true. But it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that something about the careful way that wooden marker had been carved, 2 letters, just 2, scratched deep enough to survive 15 Montana winters, told him this was not an accident, and accidents were the only kind of thing the Combe County Sheriff's Department had any practice handling. He photographed everything before he touched anything. The disturbed earth, the marker, the angle of the ground relative to the fence line, and the old well house 50 yards east. Shadow stayed beside the spot through all of it, lying flat in the cold dirt the way he had once lain flat in doorways that were wrong to walk through, refusing every command to heal until Logan finally stopped giving them. The next morning he drove into town and pulled the county land records instead of the sheriff's office, because 18 years in special operations had taught him that information moved faster through paper than through people who had reasons to be slow. What he found rearranged something in his chest. The 60 acres his father had bought in 1991 hadn't come from a stranger. It had come from the Voss family, sold off cheap. Oddly cheap, by Harlan Voss's own father in the same autumn that a 17-year-old girl named Caroline Calloway had vanished from Combe County and never come home. Logan sat in his truck outside the county clerk's office for a long time with the old deed open across the wheel, doing the kind of math that men trained to find patterns in chaos cannot stop themselves from doing, even when they very much wish they could. He drove to the library next and pulled 15-year-old newspaper microfiche, because Combe County didn't bother digitizing anything before 2015. The Combe County Sentinel had run 11 days of coverage on Caroline Calloway's disappearance before the story disappeared from the paper entirely, replaced the following week by a front-page photograph of Harlan Voss cutting a ribbon at the new county fairgrounds his family had just donated the land for. Logan read that juxtaposition twice. Then a third time. He thought about the marker in the field, 2 letters cut into old wood, and about a mother 15 years deep into a search nobody else in this county had ever taken seriously. He didn't know yet exactly what he had found. He understood only that someone in Combe County had spent 15 years making very sure nobody else found it either. Logan found Margaret Calloway's address through the church directory, and she answered her door before he'd finished knocking, like she'd been waiting on a knock for 15 years and had simply stopped being surprised by which day it finally came. He didn't tell her everything. He told her only that he'd found something on his property and that he thought it might matter to her, and watched her face do something he recognized from men receiving news in the field, the particular stillness of someone bracing for the only 2 outcomes that were left. She showed him a photograph of Caroline from her senior portrait, a girl with her mother's same sharp, steady eyes, and told him things the newspaper never had. That Caroline had been seeing a boy from the Voss ranch that fall, secretly, because Harlan Voss didn't approve of his hired hand's children mixing with people he considered beneath the family. That Caroline had told a friend, 2 days before she vanished, that she was scared of something she wouldn't name. That the sheriff at the time, a man named Dale Pruitt, had been Harlan Voss's hunting partner for 30 years and had closed the case faster than any missing person file Peggy had ever heard of since. Logan drove to the current sheriff's office that afternoon and reported what he'd found. He was met with the kind of careful, practiced caution he recognized instantly. Not disbelief exactly, but reluctance, the body language of a man doing math about his own next election before he'd finished doing math about the case. The sheriff told him he'd send someone out. He did not say when. Word moved fast in a county this small. By the next morning, before any deputy had set foot on the Reed property, Harlan Voss's attorney called Logan's cell phone directly, voice smooth and unhurried, to remind him that the land sale contract included a clause requiring the property be delivered free of any liens, disputes, or, the attorney's phrase, chosen with obvious care, complications. He suggested, gently, that whatever Logan thought he'd found in that field could surely wait until after closing. Logan said nothing for a long moment. Then he told the attorney the sale was off, effective immediately, and hung up before the man could answer. Within the hour, his neighbor down the county road, a rancher named Tom Ashby who leased grazing rights from Voss, came by unprompted to mention, casually, almost kindly, that men who made trouble for Harlan Voss in this county had a habit of losing things. Bank loans called in early. Insurance policies that suddenly found reasons not to renew. Logan thanked him for the warning and watched him drive away, and understood, with the calm clarity of a man who had been threatened by people far more dangerous than a county commissioner, that he had just confirmed everything he needed to know. The state crime lab agreed to send investigators within the week. But a week, Logan understood, was more than enough time for a man like Harlan Voss to make a problem disappear the same way he'd made one disappear 15 years earlier. The call came at 2:14 in the morning. Tom Ashby again, this time not casual at all, telling Logan in a low voice that a grader and 2 trucks had just turned off the highway and were rolling slow toward the back of the Reed property, with their headlights cut. Logan was dressed and moving before Ashby finished the sentence. Shadow was already at the door. He drove without headlights the last quarter mile, the same way he'd approached 100 compounds in 100 countries that weren't his own, and came up on foot through the tree line along the creek. 3 men. A grader idling low. A foreman directing them toward the exact patch of disturbed earth where the marker had stood, because someone, Voss, his attorney, someone with access to the sheriff's preliminary report, had told them precisely where to dig. Logan didn't shout. He didn't need to. He stepped out of the tree line into the wash of the grader's running lights with Shadow silent and rigid at his side, and the foreman's hand froze on the controls the way a man's hand freezes when his body understands a threat half a second before his mind does. "This property's under an active state investigation," Logan said. His voice didn't rise. It never needed to. "Touch that ground again and every one of you is looking at obstruction charges on top of whatever Voss is already facing." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Shadow held his position, ears forward, eyes fixed on the foreman with the same unblinking attention he'd once aimed at men carrying weapons in places far from Montana. The grader's engine idled in the dark for a long suspended moment. Then the foreman cut it. He'd take his chances with Voss's anger over what was standing in front of him right now. 3 days later, with state investigators working the site under a forensic tent, Shadow broke away from Logan's side and refused to come back. He stood at the fence line 40 yards east, digging with single-minded purpose at a spot near the old well house that nobody had marked for excavation. The lead investigator, skeptical at first, finally walked over to see what a dog could possibly know that ground-penetrating radar hadn't already found. 18 inches down, wrapped in a rotted oilskin pouch, they found a small tin box, a class ring engraved with the initials HV, a torn page from a girl's diary, and a folded note in handwriting the state lab would later match to Harlan Voss himself. Shadow lay down beside the hole and did not move again until the investigator gently asked Logan to call him off. They arrested Harlan Voss on a Tuesday morning, in the parking lot of the Combe County Bank he had owned for 30 years, in full view of the same diner counter where he'd held court for 3 decades. Logan was there because the lead investigator had asked him to identify the property line for the record, and because, if he was honest with himself, some part of him needed to see it happen with his own eyes. Voss came out of the bank in his usual gray overcoat, already mid-sentence to someone on his phone, and stopped cold at the sight of 2 state vehicles and a deputy holding a folder he clearly recognized. For a moment, the old performance tried to reassert itself. The easy confidence, the politician's smile aimed at the small crowd that had gathered outside the diner. It didn't hold. His eyes moved past the deputy to Logan, standing quiet by his truck with Shadow seated at his heel, and something in his face changed. The particular collapse of a man who has spent 30 years believing a thing could never catch up to him, and is now watching it arrive. "This is a misunderstanding," Voss said, to no one in particular, to everyone. "I'll have my attorney sort this out by lunch." The lead investigator read him his rights instead of answering. Charges of homicide, obstruction of justice, and evidence tampering, connected to the death of Caroline Calloway 15 years earlier. The diner had gone silent, the way rooms go silent, when something true finally gets said out loud, in a place that has spent a long time avoiding it. Logan didn't say a word through any of it. He didn't need to gloat, didn't need to remind anyone of the contract Voss's attorney had tried to pressure him into honoring. Didn't need to do anything but stand there and let 15 years of silence finally break in broad daylight in front of the only people who had ever had the power to ask harder questions, and hadn't. Margaret Calloway arrived 20 minutes later, alerted by a deputy who'd had the decency to call her before the local radio station did. She stood at the edge of the gathered crowd in her church coat, hands folded in front of her the way they'd been folded at 1,000 empty dinner tables for 15 years, and watched Harlan Voss put into the back of a state vehicle in handcuffs. She didn't cry. She had, she would tell Logan later, cried every available tear over the last decade and a half, and simply had none left for this particular morning. What she felt instead, she said, was something closer to weight finally lifting. Not relief exactly, because relief implied an ending that didn't bring her daughter back, but something adjacent to it, the truth, finally standing where the lie used to live. Shadow walked over to her without being asked, the way he had once walked to wounded men in the field who needed something steady beside them more than they needed words, and sat at her feet. Margaret Calloway put one hand into the thick fur at his neck and didn't move it for a long time. 6 months later, Harlan Voss pled guilty to second-degree murder and obstruction of justice, rather than face a jury that the whole county now understood would not be kind to him. He was sentenced to 30 years. Macomb County Sheriff's Department reopened 2 other cold cases from the same decade. Quietly, the way institutions move once the first domino has finally fallen. Logan never signed the land back over to anyone. He kept the 60 acres, the same acres his father had bought from a Voss family eager, it turned out, to be rid of ground that knew too much. In the spot where Shadow had first stopped walking, Logan built a small stone marker with Caroline Calloway's name on it. Her actual name this time, carved deep enough to survive 50 more Montana winters. Margaret Calloway came out every Sunday after church, and Logan had taken to leaving the gate unlocked for her on those mornings, without either of them ever discussing it as an arrangement. He thought, sometimes, about how close he'd come to signing that contract and driving away, without ever knowing what the ground beneath his boots had been holding. He thought about how a dog who couldn't speak a word of English had refused, simply refused, to let him leave without telling the truth first. Logan still didn't talk much, but he'd stopped feeling like a man waiting for his real life to begin somewhere else. It had been right here the whole time, buried under a field he'd almost sold without ever once looking down. Sometimes the truth doesn't arrive with sirens or headlines. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the stubborn refusal of a dog to keep walking, in the small act of one man choosing to look down instead of looking away. God does not always send justice in the form we expect, and He rarely sends it on the timeline we would choose, but He places it, patiently, in the path of people willing to stop and notice what the world has tried to bury, and in animals who carry a loyalty no contract could ever explain, and no silence could ever fully bury. Caroline Calloway waited 15 years for someone to finally hear her. In the end, it was 4 quiet paws, and one tired Navy SEAL who almost drove away who finally did. If Caroline's story moved you, share it with someone who still believes the truth always finds its way to the surface, no matter how long it takes. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And if you've ever felt like the world stopped looking for someone too soon, we want to hear that too. Stories like this one only travel as far as we're willing to carry them. And if you believe in loyalty, in justice that arrives late but arrives anyway, and in the quiet courage of dogs who refuse to walk past what matters, please subscribe so you never miss the next one. May God bless you, watch over the ones still waiting to be found, and give you the courage to stop and look down when something tells you to.